What's up, YouTube? This Petey. Back with another episode with Picks with Petey. Today I'm going to be going over Week 8 in NCAA football, top 25, my predictions for Week 8. But first, I'm going to give you how I did for Week 7 last week in NCAA football. I went 50%, 9 for 18 out of the top 25. I'm going to give you the teams that I went on, and that was Temple to cover and they're over. Illinois to cover in the over. Alabama to cover in the over. Arizona State to cover in the over. Clemson to cover and the over. Penn State to cover and the over. LSU to cover and the over. Utah to cover and the over. And Boise State to cover and the over. And that was the 9 games I got right out of the 18 for the top 25 NCAA Week 7. All right, now let's get to Week 8. My prediction for Week 8, top 25. First game is Ohio State versus Northwestern. They giving Ohio State, saying Ohio State going to win by 28.5. And the over and the under for that game is 49.5. I like Ohio State to cover that 28.5. Next is Clemson versus Louisville. They saying Clemson is going to win by 24.5, and over under for that game is 60.5. I like Clemson to cover the 24.5 against Louisville. Next is Florida versus South Carolina. Last week Florida lost against LSU. LSU came back and scored 21 answer points in the second half, so they got a bitter taste in their mouth about that. South Carolina beat Georgia. That was an upset last week. And the over for that game was 48. For this game is 48. I believe Florida bounced back and beat South Carolina by the 6. I'm taking Florida for the 6. Next is Auburn versus Arkansas. Auburn saying they're going to win by 18.5. The over-under for the game is 55.5. I like Auburn to cover that 18.5. Next is Wisconsin versus Illinois. Wisconsin, they're going to put up numbers. I like Wisconsin to cover 30, to cover the 31. The over for that game is 51. Next is Purdue versus Iowa. They saying Iowa is going to win by 18.5. The over-under for the game is 48.5. I like the game to go under the 48.5. Next is West Virginia versus Oklahoma. They saying Oklahoma is going to win by 33.5. The over-under for that game is 64.5. I like Oklahoma to cover the 33.5. Next is Minnesota versus Rutgers. They saying Minnesota is going to win by 28.5 versus Rutgers. I like the over for the game, and that's 47.5. Next is LSU versus Mississippi State. They saying LSU is going to win by 19. The over-under for that game is 62. LSU offense is a high-scoring offense. I like LSU to cover the 19 points. Next is UL Monroe. They playing Apache State. Apache State just broke the top 25 rank. They saying Apache State is going to win by 14.5. The over-under for the game is 67. I like UL Monroe to cover that, the 14.5, and I like the score to go over the 67. Next we have is Oregon versus Washington. The over-under for the game is 50.5. They saying Oregon is going to win by 3. I like Washington to cover that 3. Cover the field goal, so I'm going with Washington versus over Oregon. Next is Tulsa versus Cincinnati. They're saying Cincinnati is going to win by 17. The over-under for the game is 48. I like Tulsa to cover the 17 points. Then is Temple versus SMU. They're saying SMU is going to win by 7.5. The over-under for the game is 59. I like SMU to win the game, the cover, the 7.5, and the score to go over 59 points. Next is Baylor versus Oklahoma State. They saying Oklahoma State is going to win by 3.5. The over for the game is 67.5. I like the game to go over versus Baylor versus Oklahoma State to go over to 67.5. Next is Missouri versus Vanderbilt. They saying Missouri is going to win by 21.5. And the over for the game is 56. I'm going to take Vanderbilt to cover the 21.5. Next game is Kentucky versus Georgia. Georgia lost the upset against South Carolina last week. They saying Georgia going to win by the 24.5. The over for the game is 48. I like Georgia to bounce back and cover that 24.5. They feeling a certain type of way over that loss, so expect them to come out dominating against Kentucky this week. Next is Arizona State versus Utah. They saying Utah is going to win by 13.5. The over for that game is 46. I like Utah to cover the 13.5 versus Arizona State. Next is Kansas versus Texas. They saying Texas is going to win by 22. The over-under for the game is 61.5. I like Texas to cover the 22. And I like the over the 61.5 as well. Next is Michigan versus Penn State. They saying Penn State is going to win by 8.5. And the over for that game is 46.5. I like Michigan to cover the 8.5 points. And I like the score to go over the 46.5 points. Next game is Tennessee versus Alabama. They saying Alabama is going to win by 34.5. And the over for the game is 61.5. I like Alabama to cover the 34.5 against Tennessee. Last game is Boise State versus BYU. They saying Boise State is going to get 6.5 points. And the over-under for the game is 48. I like Boise State to cover the 6.5 and the score to go over 48. And that's picks with Petey, Week 8, top 25 NCAA football. And these are the lines that I'm getting for today at the moment. So I'm going to be going off the lines when next week comes. And if I win or lose, those will be the lines I'm going off for the predictions. So get money, stay humble. See you next time.